Since the subject of this essay, for some reason I can't fathom why, I decided on is politics, I think there needs to be a discussion of socialism. The discourse on the subject, especially on YouTube, is a little bit on the flat side. For this purpose I chose a small tome of Swedish social democratic theory from 1926, called Socialism Before Reality by Nils Karleby. Despite forming a few governments in the 1920s, there wasn't really any breakthrough until the 1930s. It's in this environment where the debates of what socialist politics would actually look like took place, that Karleby came with this book. It's a world where the top politicians of socialist parties still had very real relationship with figures such as Lenin, and the figure of Marx still stood high in the ideological discourse even among leading figures. In a very condensed form, the book is part of this great debate taking sides against a kind of utopian socialist thought. There was a kind of Marxian determinism saying that the crisis of capitalism would in itself lead to a socialist society, that intervention in the economy would lead to the preservation of capitalism and hinder the growth of socialist society in the ashes of a capitalist order. This, Karleby thought, was wrong. The idea is that the socialist project goes back to the core of the French Revolution. The core tenet of the French Revolution being equality, freedom and brotherhood. Only there was in the liberal bourgeois experiment a failure towards those lofty goals. The freedom, the equality and the brotherhood concerned only those in the societal ladder who could speak for themselves. Maximilien Robespierre and Georges-Jacques Danton were lawyers, for example. Though there was a strand of utopian socialist thought in France during the 18th century, it never really held any sway during the revolutionary years. It is in this context where Karl Marx arrives in the middle of the 19th century, formulating a critique of the utopianism of his predecessors, speaking of a workers' revolution for workers, not the kind of top-down utopian progressivism of aristocrats. Karleby argues then his points against the revisionism of German social democratic theorists like Karl Kautsky. Kautsky and others thought that the end of capitalism would naturally lead to a socialist society. What Karleby argues is that the point of a socialist government is not the need to socialize industry, but that the working class has to participate in the society where they have hitherto been excluded from by the bourgeois economic system called capitalism. The need, therefore, is to work for the inclusion of the working class under those key values of the French Revolution, to see equality, liberty and brotherhood through and infuse them throughout all of society, not just the parts of bourgeois class deems worthy, that is, the bourgeois. I think this might have been a general strand of thought in the 1920s, because it reminds me of something Martin Heidegger writes about the nature of existence. What Karleby does is paint those ideas in a Marxian terminology. What is important, so to speak, is not the transformation of society, but the improved experience of regular life. From this line of reasoning, he discusses how any incursion into how bourgeois society is run is a kind of incursion of socialism, that already back then, with the introduction of the simplest regulations, a level of socialism had already been introduced. He writes, "It is not the specific form of organization, but a social content that characterizes a society as socialist, regardless of the level thereof." So, with the introduction of 2 weeks of paid vacation in Sweden in 1938, the level of socialist development had been deepened. The difference between the socialist politics of early social democrats and, for example, bourgeois liberals like Franklin Roosevelt or John Kennedy is that for FDR or JFK, they saw that without the support of a majority of American citizens, they would not be able to keep the liberal bourgeois capitalist system which they wanted to maintain. The bourgeois liberals also wanted to keep the bourgeois as the ruling class of their society, whereas socialists want to, if not make the working class the ruling class, at least make them more equal to the present ruling class through social reform from the bottom up instead of the bourgeois top-down approach. Here again, I think is a good time to point at something relevant for our modern view of this. My personal view of politics is a kind of pig Marxian analysis where very simply there are two great groups of society, the working class and the bourgeois ruling class. They struggle for the position of ruling class. However, as far as I understand what the French philosopher Michel Foucault talked about, which I probably don't, he discussed the way states uses and abuses power. The state uses this power to keep dissidents down, to disenfranchise the critics of the ruling class. The thing is, while I do think he is correct, his analysis is not one of the social democratic state in specific, but of the state in general. In essence, what Carl argues is that social reform in itself is a kind of socialism. He plays down the role of socialization of industry. What oppression, he argues, does the academic or state official, though employed, really suffer? In this part of the book, Carl explains the economy. He was an economist by training and would have probably took a PhD if he hadn't died young. He talks lots about how, well, the economy works. I'll do a very short introduction about it, but move on because that's not the most interesting part, in my opinion, and not the subject of this essay. More or less, when you produce everything yourself, your food, your clothes, your tools, then the work and what that work is worth is synonymous, since all the time you spend working results in the products of that labor. That is, the food you produce is the food you produce, nothing more, nothing less. However, when you enter into a marketplace with your products, stop being worth the cost of production, and you must either become more effective or disappear. As a wage earner in the marketplace, your wage is also disconnected from the worth of production. Therefore, the wage you will earn in the free market is the lowest wage anyone will do your job for, therefore becoming even more disconnected from the worth of your labor. To go into some Marxist jargon, this is what creates the alienation effects, where you don't understand the part you play in the production line, which create angst and existential disgust. This, though Carl doesn't reason like this economist that he is, not a sociologist philosopher like Marx, is what creates the feeling of not belonging in society. Which lead to the point that for equal participation in the economy, there needs to be stability in the economic sphere, so that sprees of successive growth and crisis doesn't fuck everything up. What the secure market lead to is job security and wages that's livable, but the livable wage is not in fact enough for the market to become secure. The main way of reaching a secure market, he argues, is not, as pointed out previously, seizing the means of production. In fact, he talks about even if you had the state control the economy, you would still need a separation of political and economic power. I'm not really smart enough to understand why, though. What needs to be done is to make the shifts in the markets into secure areas for the people on the floor, so that unemployment is not, in fact, the end-all be-all of economic life. He also talks about how unions should play a role in the management of wages, so that seasonal work, for example, doesn't lead to economic instability during some parts of the year. But the main point is the introduction of social security measures, unemployment benefits, or benefits for those who can't work at all. What he's calling for, more or less, is the introduction of the social democratic welfare state. Only I think it went further than Carl could have ever imagined himself when he wrote this book. In my humble opinion, the most important socialist in the world today is Ocasio-Cortez. While Bernie Sanders is the Eugene Debs of our times, and he may, at the time of writing this video, even be president still, he's also old. Ocasio-Cortez is the face of the new radical leftist project, but she's also, well, a social democrat. If you read the comment fields of Jacobin magazine long enough, you could probably find people calling her a right-wing dissident, failing to fall into the correct socialist party line. But isn't that what this entire essay is about? How there really isn't a party line, at least in this kind of formative moment that we're in now, where nothing is really decided. I think it's really interesting to think that America could move in a more socialist direction. Many of the global institutions that plague the global scene has their roots in America, and to see American solutions to subjugation of global finance would be fascinating. What is most interesting, I think, of all is how the points in this tiny book of about 250 pages written in the mid-1920s are as valid now as they were then. Only we battle empty institutions of democracy without democratic content, not anti-democratic forces as such. Karleby attacked a utopian left, but today there is a nest of post-political party machinery as dogmatic in their belief of their own perfection as any utopian socialist. We can see it in the US Democratic Party. We can see it every time Tony Blair opens his mouth. We can see it in my country, when our social democratic government pays off state debt to creditors doesn't want the money. I mean, how much participation in society does the Uber driver feel he has? Or the single mom working 3 jobs? However, even as a social democrat, which I am, there is this nugget of ideological philosophy, or what I should term it, that I can't quite shake off. There is a simple critique of the line of reasoning that I've been presenting in this essay. Most succinctly, it is formulated by Swedish Finance Minister Ernst Wigforss. Welfare is not socialism, but it's a good start. No one has ever managed the paradigmatic shift into what comes next. The attainment of government is not enough. There must be a breaking point, and no one has cracked the code. But I think this gives an introduction to socialist politics and a way to actually think about socialist politics without being overtly general or get stuck with buzzwords. But first, I will prepare to be called a revisionist bourgeois dog, which, to be fair, I am.